Good evening, this is Kathleen Mallory, Planning and Sustainability Manager with the City of Oxnard, and I'm joined by our Climate Action and Adaptation Consultant, Jeff Caton, with Environmental Science Associates, who will be assisting in the presentation this evening. In March of 2020, Council authorized the preparation of a Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. The city hired Environmental Science Associates to work on that document. What is a climate action and adaptation plan? It's a plan for reducing the city's greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global climate change and for adapting to the anticipated effects of climate change. The main objectives are to reduce the community's greenhouse gas emissions, to meet or exceed reduction targets mandated by the state, and to enhance community resilience to a changing climate by addressing vulnerabilities and risks that are expected to occur as a result of those impacts. Examples of climate change impacts facing Oxnard include rising sea levels, increased numbers of extreme heat days, smoke from increased frequency of regional wildfires, wind events, and degradation due to these occurrences, as well as increased in coastal and local flooding from severe storms and extreme high tides. With all of that, temperatures will rise, more days with extreme heat will occur, seas will continue to rise, compounding the effects of flooding caused by storms and high tides. The state and region is expected to have more frequent, longer, and more intense droughts. Air quality is expected to worsen both from regional wildfires and from high levels of ground level ozone. Changes in precipitation could mean more flooding also from the Santa Clara River. This map here shows the Cal Environment Screen disadvantaged communities. It's an index that identifies communities most burdened by pollution from the most vulnerable of its effects, taking into account their socioeconomic characteristics and underlying health status. Red areas are in the top 10 most vulnerable populations in the state. Orange is roughly the top 25%. You can see how Oxnard fits into this definition and how these impacts can seriously affect our community and the health of our community. So what have we been working on since last year? We've actively been working with our consultant, modeling energy data generated by municipal operations, which includes wastewater, water, trash facilities, buildings, municipal fleet, or vehicles. And those are some examples of the modeling that we've done on the municipal side. We've also modeled energy data generated by other land uses in the city, from energy associated with residences, businesses, agriculture, all sorts of land use and land use types in the community. From that information, we're assessing Oxnard's climate change vulnerabilities, and this assessment will help develop strategies for the CAP. The city team engaged the community also in a logo challenge, which I'll go over and show the selected logo with the council towards the end of this presentation. And we also have developed a community survey and stakeholder interest list to begin the engagement efforts, so that we can understand the conversation regarding the climate action and adaptation plan. There's some key terms that are important to understand. Resilience and adaptation are key elements to the CAP preparation. Resilience is the capacity of any entity, an individual, a community, or an organization, or a natural system to prepare for disruptions, to recover from shocks and stress, and to adapt and grow from disruptive experiences. Climate adaptation is defined by the same source as actions that address the projected impacts on all aspects of communities' functions that may result from climate change. This can include impacts related to hazardous events such as flood, wildfire, drought, and severe storms, for example. Recognizing that greenhouse gas impacts and reductions are only one part of the solution to address climate change. The other component to affect change in the climate is adaptation, and those efforts needed to ensure preparedness and building resilience are expected to be addressed within the CAP. I'll now turn the presentation over to Jeff Caton with ESA.
Well, thanks, Kathleen. Well, the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan is being developed in response to several key statewide mandates, most notably the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2016, which is otherwise known as Senate Bill 32, This calls for a statewide reduction in greenhouse gases of 40% below 1990 levels. And also back in 2006, Governor Schwarzenegger issued Executive Order S0305, which calls for the state as a whole to reduce emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Regarding climate adaptation, SB 379 requires, which was passed in 2015, requires all cities and counties to address climate adaptation and resilience in the safety element of their general plan or in their local hazard mitigation plan. The Climate Action and Adaptation Plan will include a vulnerability assessment and strategies for adapting to climate change that will in turn inform the safety element policies in the city's next general plan update. And it's worth noting that CARB's Climate Change Scoping Plan, which was last updated in 2017, lays out the state's plan for achieving the 2030 target and calls for local governments to achieve greenhouse gas reductions in line with that state target. Next slide, please. The table and pie chart you see here summarize the results of the most recent community greenhouse gas inventory for the year 2018, broken down by sector. In greenhouse gas inventories, sectors are categories of emissions that are defined by the end use that causes them. From the table, you can see that on-road transportation is the biggest contributor to the inventory. These are emissions from cars and trucks that travel local roads and highways, followed by electricity as the second biggest contributor. That's electricity used by the community, followed by natural gas at about a fourth of the inventory, and that's emissions from natural gas used by buildings and industry throughout the community. Solid waste contributes about 7% as it's decomposing in landfills. Off-road sources are emissions from construction vehicles and other off-road equipment. And water and wastewater combined represent less than 1%. This is emissions from the electricity used to pump water and wastewater. And then a minor contributor is passenger rail, and this is emissions from Amtrak and Metrolink. Next slide, please. This table summarizes the draft results for the 2010 and 2018 community-wide inventories listed by sector and showing the change from 2010 to 2018. Overall, annual emissions have dropped by about 13%. The biggest reductions are from the energy sector, with natural gas emissions dropping about 23% and electricity dropping about 18%. On-road transportation represents the third biggest reduction, falling by about 5%. And then emissions from off-road equipment actually rose by 22.6%, and emissions from solid waste also rose. Now, several factors could explain these trends. Vehicles are generally more fuel efficient than they were 8 to 10 years ago due to state mandates. And likewise, electricity is greener or less carbon intensive because of state mandates. And you may be familiar with the state renewables portfolio standard, which requires more renewables to be part of our electricity supply over time. Oxnard's residents and businesses are generally using less energy per capita, which may reflect the adoption of the city's Energy Action Plan in 2013, which includes strategies and programs for increasing energy efficiency across the community. And in fact, the results indicate that the primary objective of that 2013 Energy Action Plan has been met to achieve a 10% reduction in energy-related emissions by 2020. Next slide, please. This table summarizes the draft results for the municipal operations inventories for 2010 and 2018. Municipal operations is a subset of the community inventory, and it only represents a small portion of overall community emissions, about 3%. This inventory allows us to develop climate action strategies that are focused on city operations, which in turn helps the city lead the way for the community and demonstrates a commitment by the city government to reduce emissions. And the results indicate that annual emissions from municipal operations have dropped by about 21% since 2010. Next slide, please. To develop a climate action plan for reducing future emissions, we need to anticipate what those future emissions are going to look like. So we've developed a business as usual forecast of community emissions based on the latest inventory and the expected growth in the city's population, jobs, and housing through the year 2050. This business as usual forecast, or BAU forecast for short, shows how Oxnard's emissions would increase in the absence of adopted state regulations for greener electricity and more fuel-efficient vehicles, and if no additional actions were taken by the city to reduce emissions. Next slide, please. The adjusted BAU forecast accounts for the effect that the state's existing energy and transportation regulations will have on future emissions. Reductions from these state measures, which are namely the Renewables Portfolio Standard and our state's vehicle fuel efficiency standards, are expected to occur regardless of whether Oxnard takes local action to reduce emissions. And you can see that these regulations are expected to be very effective in reducing emissions. However, they're not enough to get us to where we need to be according to scientific consensus and to be consistent with state policy. Next slide, please. A fundamental component of developing a climate action plan is setting future targets for emission reduction. Cities are expected to do their part in helping the state achieve its goals, including the 2030 mandate established by SB 32 and the longer-term goal for 2050 established by the governor's executive order. This figure illustrates a potential citywide target for 2030 that is aligned with the state's SB 32 target of 40% below 1990 levels, which is equivalent to a reduction of about 50% below the 2010 baseline. Note that the required reduction is larger using a 2010 baseline than it would be relative to 1990 because we have to account for the growth in emissions that has occurred from 1990 to 2010. We would use the 1990 baseline if we could, but we don't have reliable or complete data going back that far. Looking at the adjusted BAU forecast in the figure, we can see that state mandates would put the city about halfway towards meeting a state-aligned 2030 target without contributions from local reduction measures. Next slide, please. So the next step in the CAP development process is to evaluate the range of local measures that can reduce greenhouse gases. And in doing so, we'll be assessing the ability of the city to achieve a state-aligned target. This chart shows how each sector contributes to the 2030 emissions forecast and shows that the sectors with the greatest potential for reductions are on-road transportation, electricity, natural gas, and solid waste. In fact, combined, these sectors represent nearly 94% of the city's expected emissions in 2030. In developing the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, the primary strategies we expect to include, that we expect to examine include greening the electricity supply, electrifying buildings, electrifying transportation, reducing vehicle miles traveled, improving the energy efficiency of existing buildings, and striving for zero waste, and then to a lesser extent, conserving water because that has less of an effect on emissions reduction. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Jeff. As you can see, we've done quite a bit of work over the past year, and we are continuing to work actively on our Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. I wanted to show you in October 2020, the city initiated a Climate Action Plan logo contest, and I wanted to share with you the winning selected logo. This was a contest that we promoted through a variety of social media platforms. A total of 8 submissions were received. And the city's final design committee selected this logo as the winning logo, which was prepared by a local artist, Manny Bernal, who was informed of this evening's meeting and hopefully will be participating and listening. And we wanted to share this local artist's rendering, which will be promoted on our CAP and through a variety of measures to garner excitement regarding our Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. The next steps and schedule is going to be really involved and robust. We'll be kicking off our public engagement in both English and Spanish. And through this effort, we'll share information about our greenhouse gas emissions and forecasts to align with reduction targets established by the state, as Mr. Caden has indicated. And we'll be going over much of these slides that we shared with council, with the community. We'll be gathering community input on GHG reduction targets and strategies. As Jeff indicated in the prior slide, there's some potential opportunities that we'll be exploring with the committee. We'll then walk through what is climate change for the community, and we'll identify planning approaches for reductions and ways to avoid those impacts. We'll be gathering community input on the climate change vulnerabilities and priorities for taking action and developing those strategies to avoid or reduce those impacts. We'll be partnering also with community leaders and community organizations to learn more about their community needs, perspectives, to disseminate information and really involve the community to get them on board and receive their input. We are also reaching out to business owners and other Oxnard stakeholders across Oxnard's multicultural and multilingual communities. We'll be conducting community meetings and public workshops in both English and Spanish, and we'll be reaching out to stakeholder groups. We are initiating a community-wide survey in both English and Spanish, and that's attached to the report with the draft questions we'll be engaging the community with. We will then be updating the Housing and Economic Development Committee as well as Council regarding the community input on the survey, as well as the reduction strategies and targets, as well as opportunities. We'll be bringing back what the community was interested in doing to address climate change. We'll be bringing that back to the committee and council in the spring or summer this year. And along with that, we'll be bringing to council community recommended reduction targets back in spring and summer. We'll be bringing that forward. By fall or winter, we envision wrapping up our community outreach, and then we'll be bringing forward the final climate action plan to council for approval in late 2020 or early 2021. So with that, it's staff's recommendation that the City Council receive an update on our work to prepare and engage the community in the preparation of the city's climate action and adaptation plan. And Mr. Caton and I are available to answer questions at the council meeting, should there be any.